everyone, happy Friday. I'm Lizzie. I'm really excited to be here today to share our research into online misogyny and the impact that it is having on young people. Just a very quick word about me. I'm a senior policy manager at Internet Matters. Before joining Internet Matters, I worked in the policy team at the Children's Commissioner's Office, where I led on communities policy, including online safety. And I also worked across social care and youth justice policy. So I have a particular interest in how offline and online vulnerabilities intersect. And I led some research on the impact of pornography, particularly exposure to violent pornography, the role that may play in shaping and informing young people's ideas about sex and harmful sexual behaviours. And I just mentioned that because clearly that's such a closely related issue to the topics we'll be discussing this morning, and I'm sure it may come up in questions and discussions later on. So this is a quick summary of what I will try to cover off this morning if we have time. Just to apologise in advance if we happen to run over by a few minutes. I hope you can stay on because there's a lot to get through. So firstly, I'll spend a bit of time painting a picture of the manosphere, which is the world of online misogyny. And then I'll give you an overview of our data on the reach and influence of online misogyny among children and parents. Then there's an opportunity, for questions, and I'll also ask people to contribute their thoughts on Slido if the tech works for us this morning, and if not, we'll just do it through the chat on how to confront and combat online misogyny. And that's really because the trends that we've uncovered in our research are really, really concerning, and our findings have been supported by subsequent publications. For example, you might have seen a report that came out in February from King's College London on the emerging gender divide amongst young people, Generation Z. And in our policy report, we focus specifically or more primarily on the role of industry and regulation in removing the amount of misogyny in circulation online. But I'm aware that we have lots of people on the call with frontline practice experience who work directly with children. So I'd be really interested to have a bit of a discussion about how we should go about addressing the issues with young people directly. And then finally, I'll move on to the role of media literacy in protecting children from harmful online influences, and I'll give you a brief intro to some of Internet Matters resources for parents, caregivers and professionals. So I just wanted to very quickly mention a bit about Internet Matters for those of you who don't know us. Internet Matters is a leading not-for-profit aimed at supporting parents, carers and teachers now to keep children safe and happy online. We were formed 10 years ago by the 4 internet service providers, and since then our coalition has grown. Our foundational principle is that we believe every child has the right to be safe and to thrive online, and we believe that engaged and informed adults are key protective factors in children's digital lives, alongside action by industry and regulation. As well as producing our resources and support for parents, we also do a huge amount of research with families to understand what's going on in their online lives. Which takes me on to the topic of today. So I will be sharing with you findings from research that we published in September on the reach and influence of online misogyny. Before I go into the findings, I wanted to briefly talk you through the prevalence of misogynist influences online, and in particular how they go about cultivating their audiences. Before I launch into this section, I did want to give just a very brief content note, because my slides do contain quotes which endorse sexual and physical abuse of women. I've kept the quotes in the presentation because I think it's really important to understand what influencers are saying to their audiences, which are primarily young and male. But if you do want to leave at any point, that's absolutely fine. So normally at this point in my presentation, if I'm doing it in real life, I would ask people to put their hands up if they know who this man is, if they can name him. Normally, almost 100% of people put their hands up. So I think it's fairly safe to assume that most people on this call know that this is Andrew Tate. Virtually every parent, teacher or professional working with a child has had to take a crash course on Andrew Tate in the last year or so, since he burst into public consciousness. So although he's probably very familiar, I did want to say a few words about the world he inhabits, just to put our research into context. So Andrew Tate is a former kickboxer turned social media influencer. I checked this morning, he's got over 9 million followers on X, formerly known as Twitter, which is the only social media platform that he still has a platform on. In July 2022, this I still can't quite believe, but it is a fact. In July 2022, Google reported that there had been more searches for Andrew Tate than for Donald Trump and Kim Kardashian combined. And before it was barred by TikTok, the hashtag Andrew Tate had over 14 billion views on the platform. So just to give you a sense of his scale and reach. Andrew Tate is a self-described misogynist. He espouses violent misogyny to his audience, which, as our data shows, and I'll come on to that in a minute, is largely young and male. Among the many grotesque statements, some of them I've copied onto the screen, he has discussed owning women as property. He has suggested that men should sleep with 18 and 19-year-old girls because they can leave an imprint on them, and suggested that women aged 25 and above are past it and not worth men's time. He's also suggested that victims of rape hold a degree of responsibility for their assaults. As I'm sure you're aware, Andrew Tate and his brother Tristan are currently awaiting trial in Romania for multiple charges of rape and human trafficking. And recently, Romania granted the UK an extradition request. So they will also face trial in the UK once legal proceedings in Romania have concluded. I don't want to spend too long on these quotes. So many articles have been written about Andrew Tate, and I'm sure you have all heard about his violent misogyny. All I will note is that after having unfortunately spent quite a few weeks consuming his content, trying to understand it and analysing it, the one thing I will say is that he has absolutely nothing new to say. He hasn't invented a new brand of male chauvinism. These views predate Andrew Tate, they predate the internet. However, two things I think are new and are important to bear in mind. So firstly, his tactics in reaching a vast global audience with views that up until about 3 years ago were confined to fairly niche corners of society in the 21st century. And secondly, his ability to stoke the anxieties of his follower base, which is largely young and male. I think these are both really important factors to bear in mind when we come to think about how to combat his influence. And this is because over the last 18 months, we've heard about a rising tide of misogyny in schools directed towards both female pupils and female teachers, which many feel is fueled or at least informed by Andrew Tate's content. For example, there have been anecdotal reports of homework returned to female teachers with the phrase, "make me a sandwich" written across it, which is a phrase intended to degrade and humiliate women. Male teachers have been asked if they allow their wives out of the home. It's really concerning. And it's important to note that while Andrew Tate might be the only misogynist influencer that you've heard of, he's not the only one. So the term manosphere is used to describe a loose collection of misogynist influencers, YouTubers, podcasters, and forums. And it's the ecosystem that Andrew Tate inhabits and largely represents. So each of the figures on the screen are online influencers who promote misogynistic views and whom our teenage focus group participants spontaneously named. Again, if I was doing this in person, I'd ask people to raise their hands if they could name any of them. And generally, what I find is very few people can. Maybe some people can name one, possibly two at a push. But as you'll see from the numbers on this slide, while far fewer adults are aware of the personalities, they each command a sizable following, and together they represent a large online community, and it's a community that's growing and getting bigger. Like Andrew Tate, they each cultivate a worldview based on outdated gender politics, and like Andrew Tate, I would say that they filled a void. So they speak to the very real concerns and pressures facing boys and young men. And these influencers and hundreds more like them have really successfully harnessed these anxieties, and they're able to monetize them. So Andrew Tate and other influencers like them, as I said, speak to a really real set of issues facing boys and young men, whether that be feeling lonely or rejected romantically, or feeling depressed or anxious about the future. It's a fact that the material aspects of society have changed in recent decades, with a record number of young people now living with a record number of young adults, living with their parents. And a lot of teenage boys and young men have really legitimate concerns about getting a good job, earning money, owning a house. And that's particularly true if you've grown up in a context where expectations around being a provider as a man are really important. And manosphere influences contrast these challenges against the social, economic, and political emancipation experienced by women in the last century, particularly in the last 30 to 40 years. Essentially, their message is that the anxiety and insecurity that many young men face at the moment is because women have gained power over men. And the way to solve these problems is for men to regain their power over women and return to a status quo where women are used for sex and for service in the home. We know that this is a very bad offer for boys as well as, of course, for girls. But I think it's really important to understand and to take seriously the draw of the manosphere for many boys and young men. So I've included on this slide some of Andrew Tate's motivational messages for boys and young men. He calls them his tenets. And you can see how they very directly speak to the concerns that his audience might be feeling. So whether that's loneliness in the sense of wanting a brotherhood, mental health, or providing and financial success. Andrew Tate and other misogynist figures didn't arrive spontaneously. They're responding to issues, and they are offering followers community, a clearly defined enemy, straightforward solutions, and most importantly, hope. And just before I go back into our research findings, I think there are also two major events which factor into the rise of Andrew Tate and online misogyny, particularly over the last couple of years. So firstly, one thing I think we can't ignore is COVID. So over the lockdowns, we know that a lot of young people were spending huge amounts of time online, largely unsupervised, getting drawn further and further into algorithmic bubbles. And we also know that a lot of children experienced a lot of trauma during that period. We know that domestic violence increased and tensions in the home, and that some families really struggled to adjust during that period. And it was a time of loneliness for a lot of young people and confusion. And then another factor that I think we do need to talk about is that, particularly for young people in the UK, I don't know if we have people on the call from other countries, but there have been big national conversations about sexual harassment in schools following the Everyone's Invited movement in 2021. This provided a really important space for victims of sexual harassment and abuse to share their experiences, who were predominantly girls and young women. And it particularly shone a light on how teachers and school leaders really underestimated the scale of sexual violence amongst peer groups, and also the barriers that a lot of young women and girls faced in disclosing their abuse. And it was obviously incredibly important, but I think we can also see how this understandably would have been quite scary for a lot of boys, particularly teenagers, possibly already feeling quite insecure about sex and their sexuality. And with terms like toxic masculinity being used more widely in these conversations, I think it's quite easy to see how conversations about male violence could feel quite exclusionary if they weren't explained in a careful and inclusive way. And even if the intention of terms like toxic masculinity is to remove damaging stereotypes which are harmful to both boys and to girls, you can see how it might be reframed and heard by some boys that masculinity is something that's always toxic or intrinsically harmful, and there's something negative about being a man. And unfortunately, during this period, when a significant number of boys were possibly feeling insecure and anxious and looking for something that made sense to them and didn't blame them, that space was taken up by Andrew Tate. And his message to young men was, you're not the problem, you're not to blame, you need to take your power back, you need to have less responsibility, not more responsibility. And you can see how within this context, with all of these factors at play, that could be quite an appealing message. So on to our research findings. With all of that in mind, I won't spend too long talking about the methodology, but essentially we conducted a nationally representative survey of 2,000 parents and 1,000 children aged 9 to 16, and we also held focus groups with teenage boys, teenage girls, non-binary teenagers, and parents. And the quotes you'll see on the slides are from those focus groups. So this slide shows awareness of Andrew Tate among children aged 9 to 16. As we would expect, familiarity with Andrew Tate does increase progressively with age, although it's worth noting that pronounced jump in awareness between children aged 9 to 10 and those aged 11 to 12, where there's an 18 percentage point increase. The clear milestone here for many children is obviously transition to secondary school, along with more autonomy online, for example, interacting on gaming platforms and having their own social media profiles. And I think this finding in particular speaks to the importance of laying groundwork with primary school children early and building their digital resilience with proactive conversations about harmful influences to get ahead of exposure. Although that's obviously not to underplay the significance of 41% of 9 to 10-year-olds already being aware of him. So we found that sources of information about Andrew Tate evolve in quite clear ways with age as well. I'm sorry that the bars are quite thin, but what I wanted to draw your attention to was the first two lines. So we see that older children are significantly more likely than younger children to see content from Andrew Tate on social media and content from others posting about Andrew Tate on social media, which may be supportive or critical of his output, we don't know. While on the third line, we see that information from schools appears to decline after age 11 to 12, and conversations with parents remain largely static. Again, I think these findings really underscore the importance of building that digital resilience to misogyny early on, before they're at risk of viewing harmful content. And it also underlines the importance of ensuring that conversations are sustained at schools and with parents over time. This slide shows the in-depth knowledge about Andrew Tate, i.e. the percentage of children who state that they know a lot about the influencer is closely correlated with gender. So boys are significantly more likely than girls at every single age to know a lot about Andrew Tate, and the rate of in-depth knowledge about Andrew Tate is also higher among boys than among girls. And finally, we see that some sources of knowledge about Andrew Tate are driven by children's gender. So boys are significantly more likely than girls to have seen content from Andrew Tate on their social media feeds. And that was a point that was really reinforced through our focus groups as well, where boys told us it was almost inescapable, this kind of content on their feeds. And so on to parents. Overall, we found that more parents than children know who Andrew Tate is. So overall, 81% of parents are aware of him compared to 59% of children. And dads are more likely than mums to have heard of Andrew Tate. So you'll see, particularly in that under 30 category, 95% of dads are aware of Andrew Tate compared to 78% of mums. And then that converges as parents get older. Interestingly, we also found that parents of boys are more likely to have heard of Andrew Tate compared to parents of girls. And in particular, parents of boys are more likely to have heard about him directly from their child or from their child's school, whereas parents of girls were significantly more likely to have heard about him through the news. And then on to what our children and parents think about Andrew Tate. So this slide shows attitudes to Andrew Tate among children. So what you'll see is there's a fairly stark difference between boys and girls, which is perhaps unsurprising. And the difference in attitudes is statistically significant amongst all age groups between boys and girls. So among boys who've heard of Andrew Tate, A significant minority among all ages state that they like him or they have a favourable impression of him. So 1 in 5 of those aged 9 to 11 and almost 1 in 4 of those aged 15 to 16. Although we're somewhat heartened by the fact that at every age they are still in the minority. Nevertheless, they are a significant minority. If you think in a classroom, 1 in 5 or 1 in 4 boys is a lot and is would likely to have quite a damaging impact on girls around them. And I'll come back to that point in a minute. Nevertheless, so there's, sorry, yeah. Anyway, so it does present a real concern. And then on to our case study. So this came up in our focus group where girls really shared this sense of responsibility they felt to educate particularly younger brothers and also male peers about Andrew Tate. This is a case study from a girl called Amy, whose name we've changed. She's 17. She told us about a group project at college. She was appointed the lead on the project by the teacher, but in the group she was the only girl. And she said that the boys in the group all really liked Andrew Tate and they spent all their time quoting him to her incessantly. They told her that they wouldn't do any work that she set them on the project because she's a woman and they won't listen to a woman. She reported it to college staff, but no action was taken. So she suggested that unlike school, colleges just don't really get involved in that kind of stuff. And then on to parents. So this slide sets out parents' reactions to Andrew Tate. As I'm sure you've spotted, if you look at the top, among young dads, the percentage of young dads who've expressed approval for Andrew Tate is in fact much higher than among teenage boys. So overall, we found that over half, or 56% of dads aged 25 to 34 have a positive impression of Andrew Tate, which is significantly higher than the 22% who have a negative view. Among dads aged 35 to 44, opinions are pretty evenly spread, with roughly a third having a positive view, a third neutral, and a third negative, while positive impressions of Andrew Tate are generally pretty low amongst mums, particularly those aged 35 and above. So looking at this slide, the open question, and a particularly challenging one for us as a parenting organisation, is how do we reach dads? And also, what do we do in a situation where, unlike a lot of other online issues, in this case, parents may not be the best source of safety and support. So we're not sure from this data the exact kind of source of appeal for Andrew Tate for those dads who say that they like him. Andrew Tate majors on conspicuous consumption and an aspirational lifestyle. He offers his followers finance and business advice, sometimes for free, sometimes at a premium. And 2 dads in our focus groups did say that they found him motivational, and they suggested that some of what he had to say was legitimate, even though they distanced themselves from all of his misogynistic output. But regardless, we know that Tate's kind of lifestyle content is often the entry point to grab his followers, and the toxic masculinity and the misogyny is deeply embedded in his output. So regardless of the source of his appeal to dads, the extent of the approval among dads is really concerning. And then we do seem to see this influence borne out in reactions to opinion statements about online misogyny. So we put 3 statements to our survey respondents. These were: people exaggerate how common misogyny is a serious problem online, and children should be taught about the dangers of misogyny in school. And in all of those, we found a statistically significant difference between mums and dads, which basically means that it's likely to be the result of a real difference in opinion between the populations as opposed to random chance. The biggest difference we see is responses to people exaggerate how common misogyny is, with 40% of dads agreeing with that statement compared to 22% of mums. And we also found that, unlike among mums, where attitudes to misogyny appear to be pretty consistent with age, among dads, it's actually the younger dads who have slightly more permissive views on misogyny. So this includes 58% of dads aged 25 to 34 who think that people exaggerate how common misogyny is, compared to 20% of dads aged 55 to 64. And 51% of dads this age who don't think that misogyny is a serious problem online, compared to 23% of dads aged 55 to 64. And then finally, I'll open up to questions shortly, I promise. As with sources of information about Andrew Tate, we also found that parents' attitudes to misogyny appear to be influenced by the gender of their children. So we took out parents who have both boys and girls, so son and a daughter in the family, and we looked at parents who only have male children or female children, and we compared attitudes of the parents of boys versus parents of girls. So all the statements are significantly different, and we see that almost half of parents of boys think that people exaggerate the prevalence of misogyny, compared to less than a quarter of parents of girls, which is a huge 26 percentage point difference. While over half of parents of girls think that misogyny is a serious problem online, which is 8 percentage points more than parents of boys only. So I've probably overwhelmed you with a lot of information there. So I'm happy to answer any questions or take any comments. I don't know if there's anything in the chat, Sarah, and you might be able to help.
Yeah, we have got one question for you, Lizzie. So Tim's asked whether there is any kind of link between Andrew Tate and those similar to him to incels.
Yeah, so incels are kind of put within that manosphere umbrella. So like I said, they are quite a loose confederacy and there are disagreements within there, but the thing that unites them is their kind of general assessment that all the issues facing men are because women have gained more empowerment, or as they see it, power over men. And there's research showing that kind of the more like mainstream misogyny, which kind of Andrew Tate represents and is quite prevalent on social media, can create a pathway for young people to then go into more extreme forums and communities like incels. For those of you that don't know, incel basically is a term, it's used to describe people who define themselves as involuntary celibates. So they think that they can't get a romantic partner because they have kind of conspiracies around women's perceptions of men and kind of the changing nature of sexual relationships. And there's a lot of research showing how damaging those communities can be for the young men that are involved in them on their mental health. There's a lot of research showing how they promote self-harm and suicide, and there have been some really troubling cases in America involving shootings of women. So it's very concerning, and there are relationships.
Yeah. Thanks, Lizzie. We have Daly, you have your hand up. Do you want to come in and ask Lizzie a question?
Yeah, hi Lizzie. Thanks for the presentation. It was brilliant. Quick question to you around the social media algorithms. Has any work been kind of done to look into that and actually work out how young males, particularly very young people going on there, are actually being targeted? Is it initially when they put in their age and their date of birth into the social media, or you think it's what they're actually kind of looking at? So say, for instance, I look on YouTube, if I watch X amount of videos, it will start recommending videos which it thinks are similar, but also it recommends videos which I've never looked at anything like that, but I'm guessing it's thinking, okay, it knows I'm a male, it knows roughly how old I am. So do you know which one it is? Is it people are selling the details, the first one, or is it second one, or is it both?
It's absolutely both. And I think the thing that's most troubling is that in our focus groups with teenage boys, they very much felt, so a few of them were really vociferously against Andrew Tate and misogynist influences, but they felt simply by existing as a teenage boy on these platforms, they get recommended this content. And so they'll actively say, I don't want to see this, and it still gets fed to them. So it's both. Obviously, then if you engage with the content, you get more and more and more. Social media platforms use algorithms to curate and personalize people's feeds. So they'll look at a whole load of factors, really complicated algorithms like assessing their interests, their engagements, their friends, their social histories. And when you engage with content of a similar topic, then you generally get more and more and more of it. So a big focus in our policy report was about recommending that obviously platforms need to take much stronger action to deplatform these influencers, including we recommend that platforms should introduce a reporting function where you can report something as misogyny, because at the moment you can normally report something as online hate but not specifically as misogyny. So we think that would be a much better way for them to work out where this content is and take it down really quickly. And obviously Ofcom is now beginning their regulation of social media platforms, and that will be a big part of it as well.
So would you say that,
sorry, Daly, go on.
Sorry, would you say that the social media platforms are then guilty of programming these algorithms to directly signpost? Is there financial beneficial to them because they think, okay, this content, Andrew Tate's, X million people watch him, if we can get our person here, we know he's around 14 or 15. Is it just a financial, or is it just an algorithm which is just on its own, if you understand?
Yeah, no, I do understand. I'd say it depends when you're talking about, because Andrew Tate went really viral in 2022, and at that point, because there was such an outrage, rightfully, amongst parents and teachers and also a lot of young people, he was taken down. So he doesn't have a platform on TikTok anymore or on any Meta platforms. He's still on Twitter, so it also depends which social platform you're talking about. But a lot of platforms, probably with the exception of Twitter X, have really strong policies against forms of online hate, including misogyny. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't slip through the net. And every time they deplatform a misogynist influencer, another one appears. So it really they need to take more safety by design approaches to it, because these people are making money out of spreading these hate and division among young people.
It leads us nicely on, actually, Lizzie, to another question that we've had from Stephanie. Do you see the new Online Safety Act as a positive step forward to safeguard young people online? That's a big question.
That's a very big question. I'd love to say yes. Yeah, I did a lot of work on the online safety bill as it was going through Parliament in my last job, and there was a lot of campaigning around making sure that violence against women and girls was put on the face of the bill, which it has been. So a last-minute concession was made. So Ofcom now has to produce guidance on violence against women and girls as part of their safety duties, although that's not happening until February next year. Another conversation about how long it's all taking for regulation to happen. That was a lot of amazing campaigning in the women's sector, and Baroness Nikki Morgan, who put through that amendment. So hopefully it will make a big difference, and particularly Ofcom have to take a really particular view on the safety of children and how much harmful content they're viewing. It won't be a silver bullet. It's not going to change everything overnight. It's not going to get rid of this stuff, but it means that we have a vehicle now to hold platforms to account, and particularly with transparency. So they'll have to submit transparency reports to Ofcom on the volume of this stuff that's on their platforms, and that's a really important part of it as well, because so much of it is still in the black box of these social media platforms, and we don't actually know what they know about it as well.
Oh, thank you. I think what I'd be really interested as well is when we actually have a stated case. So we have something to work from where social media platforms are being held to account, where they haven't removed harmful content and someone is actually being prosecuted, and then it'll make other social media platforms sort of start to be more vigilant and be more proactive around making sure their content is not harmful for young people.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thanks, Stephanie. We've had a comment from Peach who said we've done some healthy relationship work with colleges, which obviously you've mentioned with the example you gave from research, and found your findings are mirrored in their experiences too. And most concerning, they found young people seemed to more likely believe that people had lied about sexual violence than not, which fits in with a real victim blaming narrative as well, doesn't it? That we're still trying to tackle and challenge across the country and globally.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that.
Okay. We have got one more question from Tim, but I feel like we might have answered that. So Tim, feel free to ask if not. He has said, what about deplatforming? So does Andrew Tate have a presence on other alternative platforms? So I know that you spoke about him being taken off TikTok and the Meta platforms. He's still present on X currently. Are there other areas where he is accessing, or others similar to him, I guess?
Yeah, absolutely. So Andrew Tate still has an absolutely massive platform. So 9 million people on Twitter. The minimum age for Twitter is 13. So it's very easy to access his content. I unfortunately have followed him on Twitter because we had to for research purposes, and he's still prolific on there. He's posting every single day. So he still has a massive platform. He also has his Hustlers Academy, which he runs for kind of, it's like business advice for young people, and there are different tiers where you can access different forms of content that he provides his audience. So he still has a massive following. And kind of as a more general point about deplatforming, if it doesn't solve it, because there'll always be ways for these influencers to get around it, but it does do a massive job of cutting the revenue streams and really disrupting the way that this online hate is funded. So we are huge advocates for platforms deplatforming really proactively as well before they start gaining traction in a follower base. But as big platforms like TikTok and Meta take more action in reaction to kind of public sentiment on these issues, we're seeing that they're going to different platforms which are less regulated, like X, and also smaller platforms as well.
Thank you. Tim, did you want to come in? I've seen you put your hand up.
Just hiya. Yeah, I've done a lot of work on the alternative platforms. I mean, we talk about X and Meta, but we have to understand also that the sites like BitTube, Telegram, and they are populated an awful lot by young men. There are a whole range of alternative platforms that are unregulated, unmonitored. And from my experience and experience talking to some colleagues, they know that a lot of young people will actually bypass the more regular, well-known channels and actually go on there as well. And that is where, I mean, I've just looked on BitTube, which is like a YouTube without any moderation. And there are loads and loads of videos about Andrew Tate on there as well. So it's just something else that I think we have to just be aware of, that whilst we have the popular ones that we all know about, Meta, etc., there is a huge presence on these alternative ones, because they're obviously populated also by a lot of conspiracy, far right, etc. So there is a whole arena there as well that I just think we have to understand that people are getting these messages from those areas as well.
I completely agree. And yeah, that was a big part of our research as well, was exploring how a lot of these influencers, what they'll do is they'll have a kind of like public persona on the mainstream sites, and they're very clever with towing the line on content moderation policies on somewhere like TikTok. They know what they can and can't say to be removed, and they'll also use kind of financial advice, nutrition advice, like fitness and weightlifting, all these kind of like slightly more palatable things, and it will be the entry point for kind of young social media influencers, and they'll link out to smaller sites where they express more of their harmful views. And the kind of the business model is to instill this kind of conspiratorial worldview based on the fact that everything's set against you. It's going to be really hard for you as a young man. Like, here's the advice, and they'll offer them kind of subscriptions to kind of different forms of advice and motivational content, and it's really in their kind of financial interest to instill those anxieties in young men. So it is really concerning, and a big part of so we've been submitting evidence to Ofcom as they've been setting up their regulation, and a big part of our kind of submissions to them in our evidence has been making sure that they do regulate the smaller sites as well, because it's easy to focus on TikTok and Snapchat and the big ones, and forget that actually those can just be an entry point to less regulated platforms, and it's really important that Ofcom are kind of seeing their responsibilities on them as well.
Lizzie, can I ask, so Vicky's asked, how does this impact on image-based sexual abuse, for example, harmful sexual behaviours, and also in stopping boys from reporting abuse, which we know is massively underreported?
Yeah, those are both really good questions. On the image-based abuse, we also, in the same report, we did research on image-based abuse and really looking at it as the relationship between exposure to misogynistic cultures and communities and how those translate into harmful behaviours. And I was originally going to share those findings, but I just felt there was so much to get through. So I'm happy to come back and share some stuff about image-based abuse. But we had some really concerning findings, like, off the top of my head, 14% of teenagers aged 13 to 16 having experienced a form of image-based abuse. And we know that it does affect girls more, but that barriers to reporting, as you said, for boys are much higher. And we also found that vulnerable children, so we define vulnerable as having a mental or physical health disability or requiring SEND support, we found that they were significantly more likely to have experienced image-based abuse, and children on free school meals, which is kind of a proxy for financial disadvantage. So I'm happy to come back and share those. But in the focus groups, teenage girls in particular really made that clear connection between, like Andrew Tate tells boys that they own girls, and that means that they think they own images of us. So if they see it, like if they get an image, they feel completely free to share those amongst their peer groups. So one definitely leads into the other.
I think we have, sorry, I got to my mic before I got to my camera, but hi, I'm Rhiannon, I'm Head of Advocacy at MCF, but just picking up on that last point, I think we do see that in practice, and not necessarily from young people, but we have seen examples where adult men are talking in that way, as in that they own those images, and they can do what they like with them, which is obviously challenged with, do you know what consent is, and do you know actually who owns that picture? But that is the concerning thing, is that if that is either is now a normalized view or is becoming a very normalized view in society of how that will be impacting on young people. And while we're fighting for, children to be protected from technology assisted CSA and from image-based abuse, if that's being countered with this narrative, it's very concerning for young people. I know that our lived experience group in particular are very concerned about this topic around misogyny and just how prevalent it is, and some of the quite extreme views that are coming through, and how that feeds into abuse. It's something that gets discussed in our meetings quite frequently. So this has been really, really interesting for me. Was anybody else surprised by the figures of the young dads? Like, I feel like I shouldn't be. I feel like in my head, like I must have known that, but then seeing it, I was like, oh God. And what messaging are their kids getting now?
Completely, and we were really taken aback by it as well. So don't feel like you shouldn't have been, because we did this survey, and I think normally when you do research you have some sort of sense of the type of findings you're going to get back when you design your research questions, and really we were thinking that there's a real issue amongst teenage boys and that's what we want to explore. And then we got the parents' results back and we were like, wow, there's a real issue there amongst younger dads. Possibly, I think, if we think about the age, they grew up with digital devices and exposure to pornography at a really young age, online pornography, and possibly without some of the advances that are now happening in schools to kind of equip young people with kind of healthy relationships through RSE and also media literacy. And I'm not saying that that's perfect by any means, and I have lots of comments on how that could be more better achieved, but it is really concerning. And we were kind of left thinking, gosh, like what do we need to do to reach dads? Because like you said, it's really worrying if you think a child's growing up in homes where these views are normalized and accepted and even endorsed. So obviously schools have to play a much bigger role there, as well as tech firms doing much more to prevent these kind of views from being shared, as we've talked about.
It's interesting because I know you mentioned, and you've just referred to it there about, sometimes maybe it isn't parents that we should be aiming some of the resources and messaging at, because they, in some circumstances, they may not be the best protective factor. But it is making me question how we can tailor resources that are aimed at parents to try and take this into account. Is there additional messaging that we put in, or do we phrase things in slightly different ways to make sure that those really vital messages to parents are still going through?
Oh, sorry, I think I've lost control of my slides.
Sorry, I've just stopped the slide because I know there's more to come, but I know there's some really good conversation, so I thought I'd get your faces back on screen. Apologies.
No, it's fine. I was just suddenly it said you've lost control, and that's just a scary message. No, that's fine, thanks.
There are some more questions, so I am conscious that I know you wanted to talk about image-based harm as well, but perhaps because we have everyone here and we're talking about misogyny, it'd be great to carry on with those questions and those discussions, and maybe bring, as you've already offered, Lizzie, to bring you back another time to talk about image-based harm and abuse. I'm conscious, bear with me 1 second, because quite a few have now come through.
I have a couple more slides on misogyny which might be helpful for the rest of the discussion, so just a few pointers on starting a conversation. So I think I've seen a couple of questions about that, so I was thinking maybe if I do those quickly and then we can come back to more questions.
That sounds like a good idea. Yeah,
cool. All right, I'll jump back in, give me a moment. So yeah, and you're exactly right, we had to do a lot of thinking about how do you tailor messages for parents if they're already kind of inundated with this content or drawn to it for a reason, for whether it's for motivational reasons or because they actually do agree with some of the more misogynistic stuff. It's really concerning. So moving on to starting a conversation about online misogyny, I'll do this part really quickly and I'll also show you some of our resources that we've developed. So our role is obviously to inform parents and caregivers and also teachers, and to offer advice on online issues. So we've done some thinking since the research on how to approach these conversations, and we've spoken to experts, including organisations that deliver this kind of training in schools. So here's some of our thinking. Firstly, it's really important to be on the front foot. So the age at which a child is first exposed to harmful online content, whether that's pornography or misogyny or violent content, is really predicated by the naughtiest child in their class. So it's very likely that children are seeing these things much earlier than their parents and possibly their teachers as well estimate. So age appropriate conversations starting really early is so important, and it's important that they're grounded in media literacy. So thinking about how digital content is created and shared, and also above all, most importantly, making sure that children know that there's a trusted adult they can go to if they've seen something upsetting online, and not being judgmental about what that might be or how they came across it, but just making sure they have a place to share things that they might have seen online. And we have tons of resources on the IM website on starting those conversations. And then on the more reactive side, so if a child has latched on to ideas of misogyny from influencers like Tate and it's becoming an issue in their behaviour, we would advise thinking about a few things. And I'm interested in other people's thoughts as well, if there are other things from your experience which work. So firstly, thinking, are there any underlying drivers behind these thoughts? So possibly social isolation or poor mental health, problematic peer groups, things like that. The draw to misogynistic content might be a symptom of a real issue going on in their lives, so it's really important to think about that first. And then thinking about starting these conversations to really pick apart the harmful influences on ideas. It's really, really difficult because these influences basically preempt any arguments that adults might make, and they'll basically arm their followers with counter arguments. So it's really important to avoid knee-jerk reactions. We think that conversations should start from a recognition and even openly acknowledging with the young person that it's a really difficult conversation. It can't be from the point of view that you have all the answers and that they're wrong, because that approach will probably just further isolate them and entrench the harmful ideas. Instead, it's important to be curious, ask lots of questions, and genuinely listen to their answers with empathy and try to understand their concerns in a non-judgmental way. And then some helpful ways to kind of steer the conversation, once you've got them opening up and talking, might be to encourage the young person to think about how misogynistic influences derive their profits. So how it could be in their financial interests to instill these kind of harmful ideas, but really do allow the young person to come to that conclusion on their own. So I think it's really important that they own that understanding that, you know, this is how the business model works. And also allowing the young person to widen their definition of masculinity, and what a boy or a man should be. We know that gender stereotypes can be really harmful to both men and to women in different ways. So, for example, some conceptions of masculinity, like appearing invulnerable and not sharing your feelings, can make it much harder to form relationships, and this can lead to loneliness and poor mental health. So giving boys the permission to go beyond some of those narrow expectations of masculinity is really important, and perhaps even underscoring the fact that some characteristics which are aren't necessarily associated traditionally with masculinity, like being a good listener, helping out at home, those kind of things, might actually be really valued by a romantic partner and might increase your likelihood of finding someone. So those are just some thoughts, and like I said, interested to hear others. Realise we're really short on time and some people might want to drop off soon. So just to give you a kind of like very quick whistle stop on Internet Matters resources, we have loads of advice. It's all structured by issue areas, and we also structure it by age and by platform and device, those kind of things. And we have a misogyny advice hub, which has tons of information and advice on it, including all the definitions that you need to know. But it's not to say like you need to learn every single definition at all, but just to give you maybe some more confidence with starting a conversation. And then we have our How to Talk About Misogyny conversation guide. Sorry, I'm going through this so fast, but if you go on the website, it's all really clearly laid out. And then we also have something called My Family's Digital Toolkit, which is free and accessible on our website. And this is really based on the fact that we know there's a huge amount of information on our website, and we know that parents and carers and professionals just don't necessarily have the time to get through it all and to dig through and find the information they need at the right moment. So this tool allows parents to input their child's information, so their age, the kind of things they like doing online, the platforms they're on, the devices they own, and then you get a personalised toolkit and it gets updated when your child gets older. So that's a really helpful resource. And then just finally, here's a heads up on some more events and research that are coming out which are related to these themes we've been discussing. So on Monday, we're launching some new research into the online experiences of teenage girls, and we're really excited that Nikki Morgan is giving a keynote. And this was basically some research finding that girls and parents are normalising the fact that girls are experiencing cyber flashing online as well as other inappropriate messages from men. It's really, really worrying, and also highlights kind of complex dilemmas that girls face online. So do sign up on Eventbrite if you'd like to join. That's this Monday. And then in May, we're launching some research into preventing sexual image sharing among 11 to 13-year-olds, and that responds to the Internet Watch Foundation statistics on the rise in the volume of self-generated sexual imagery they're finding in that age group. And we're also really excited that Jess Phillips will be keynoting that event. And then finally in June, Internet Matters is celebrating our 10th birthday, and we are doing all sorts of things to celebrate that, including a manifesto for media literacy, which looks at how to embed media literacy in the curriculum so that children are more resilient to harmful influences like misogyny and other things. So I will stop speaking. Sorry, that was so fast, but happy to open up to questions again if there are people who can join for longer.
I've definitely got some questions for you. If we leave the slide up for a moment, then you've all got access to Lizzie's contact information where you can get directly in touch, and then we'll perhaps pop those slides down. But there were quite a few questions around kind of resources and useful tools for us as professionals as well as families. So hopefully that's all been covered. But We have a question from Julie who asked about gang affiliation and supporting also young people who are not in education, and any work that might be happening there.
Gosh, yeah, that's a really good question. We didn't explore it specifically in this research, but we do know that there's a huge issue with reaching interventions, particularly in a context where youth services have been so stripped financially, but reaching young people with interventions early on, and actually Revealing Reality, which is a research agency, they did some really interesting research on how platforms, I think specifically they looked at Snapchat, how that fuels violence, like offline violence amongst certain communities. So it's really concerning, and obviously more work needs to be done, and particularly good funding for services to reach children who aren't in full-time education for whatever reason, or who are otherwise marginalised. So that's a really important point.
Thank you. So Day asked a question, and a few people have agreed actually, and are wondering the same. The statistics, there was quite a few shocked people, as Rhiannon kind of mentioned, around the young dads in particular. But they'd like to know if there was a difference between, if we even know, I guess, that whether there was a difference between those young dads who had boys and those who had girls.
That's a good question. So I wanted to do some analysis, but then the sample sizes get really small at that point. So you can't infer any trends because you just get down to such small numbers. But definitely when we look at the relationships, like in age, when you look at the trends over time with dads, and then also the differences between parents of boys and parents of girls, then I think it's like a fair inference to say there's probably a relationship there as well. As if you're younger and you've only got boys, you're more likely to hold those views than if you're older and you have girls, because those are two trends that we saw in the data.
And Alex has said the socio-cultural element of this is really interesting. I think there's lots of thank yous as well, so it's very clear that there's a lot of need for us to have these discussions and to have you come and speak with us today. But how do we create space for good quality discussions with children to support critical thinking, so rather than shutting those conversations down, and with a group thinking without that need to fit in, and how influential peers are, so the need to support educators to sensitively facilitate these conversations between children. And there's a reflection there, I guess, from Alex, that there's a real need to upskill staff to feel more confident in this delivery. I mean, potentially, I guess there's even a question of around whether subject matter such as this should be part of our PSHE curriculum.
Definitely, yeah, you've picked up on lots of really big and important points there about education, and how in many places, not everywhere, but many places are really failing children on that front. And that's not to really lay the blame with schools, because so we're doing some research at the moment on media literacy and how that's delivered through schools, and they just face so many different pressures, as we all know, and in terms of time tables and funding and all those sorts of things. So it is really, really, really hard for schools. So we will be doing our manifesto for media literacy in June, and that involves a whole load of recommendations for government, whether that's the current government or possibly a new government, on how to embed this stuff properly in schools. So teacher training is a really big part of that. Teachers feel understandably really overwhelmed. Some schools get an external provision and expert organisations to deliver this type of content, which is great, but it's not always an option. And I think it's so important that when teachers are delivering this content, they feel confident in doing it, they know how to do it well. We've heard some really troubling examples of teachers delivering really sensitive topics in RSE on image sharing and also misogyny, and feeling really scared of opening up to discussion because they don't want any safeguarding disclosures made. So they won't ask the children to share anything. They'll just sit on their PowerPoint, click through it, and that's it. And that's just the absolute worst way to teach about it. We did some focus groups with children aged 11 to 18, and a big issue as well is having mixed gender groups and also really large classes where the girls said the boys basically mess around and they make it really hard for them to share their experiences in a healthy and constructive way. So there are all sorts of issues at play, and some of that research I put on the slide will be talking to those and thinking about how we kind of restructure and reframe the importance of media literacy in schools.
Yeah, and I guess from parents right through to staff in schools, having that confidence to be able to talk about it without worrying about what might be said and how I then might deal with what's said, and kind of that ripple effect, I guess, because you want the children and young people to get involved in those conversations. We can worry quite a lot as practitioners about getting it wrong and not wanting to say the wrong thing. It's very clear, isn't it, from things you said sort of really early on today, laying the groundwork early, particularly from primary school ages even, is so very important, and that's something that we advocate for, having those conversations when we know that access to pornography, to influencers or in the manosphere like Andrew Tate, right through to kind of the coercion of image-based sharing, image-based harm, is happening at even younger and younger ages. So we need to be open to having conversations, no matter who we are, and almost getting comfortable with the uncomfortable. I think, to be able to kind of address that and to take that fear factor out, I guess. But Vicky's reflected that it's why topics and situations like this, along with health, needs that public health approach, starting in those early years to have that impact. Yeah, there's Peach is saying that last night on Channel 4 News, Kathy Newman watched an AI video of herself, pornography, and was evidently very upsetting. And that's happening to young people, as somebody's commented that with technology and the apps being able to nudify young people through AI, there's a lot of work that we still have to do, all of us in schools, at home, in all of our jobs, to safeguard and protect children from those who wish to commit harm.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, there's so much, and I think we could probably have you all afternoon, Lizzie, if I'm honest, to talk about this topic, because we could unpick it so much more, and there is so much more to do. And I know that you wanted to talk about image-based harm, so yes, if we can bring you back, that would be lovely. So everybody can keep their eyes out. If you don't follow us on our social media platforms, please do. And the same, you can register for our newsletter as well on the Mary Collins Foundation website. We'll pop a link into the chat for that as well, but we would definitely like to talk about that much more. So thank you very much. There's some real positive reflections coming through on the chat, Lizzie, so if you've got time before you leave to take a minute to look at that. And thank you everybody for coming along. I will send through, Lizzie, you're happy for us to share the slides and the information, and we'll share the links to the research that you've talked about, and I'll also send a forms document through that will just be a couple of minutes worth of your reflections for feedback, because that's always useful for us as well. If that's okay with everybody, I'll pop that through on an email to you. But yeah, Lizzie, thank you very much. Much appreciated.
Thank you so much, and for all the really interesting questions as well. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good afternoon, good weekend.
Bye.